It's amazing that explaining life's immense diversity all comes down to some genetics and some biochemistry. And life on Earth is just one family. And what's true for you is true for all biology.
Hello, welcome to the final genetic shambles in the series. Except, well, there's going to be a little genetic shambles actually in our 24-hour show, which is going to be coming from King's Place, our live show on the 12th of December. Well, between midday of the 12th of December, midday on the 13th of December. But this is the main series coming to an end with a fantastic guest. So I will first of all just say a few thank yous. So first of all, thank you to the Genetics Society and Milner Centre for Evolution at the University of Bath, which is the reason that we've been making these during lockdown, post-lockdown, and now lockdown again. Also, I'll mention a couple of other things. We started off with expert panels on COVID-19. All of the panels that we've done, you can still listen to those. They are, and watch them as well, should you wish to. They're Genetics Unzipped, and they're also at cosmicshambles.com. That's the visual version. On the 12th, actually mentioned the 24-hour show, we've got an expert panel. Again, we're going to be talking about COVID, and that's with Emma Hodcroft and Dan Davis, who you'll have seen. I think both of them have been up a couple of times on this series and on other things that we've done about COVID-19 over the last few months. And if you'd like to ask any questions, then just go to live chat, and our producer Trent will make sure I see them, or you can just go to our Twitter account at Cosmic Shambles and send any questions for Professor Steve Jones there, because that is our guest. Our guest is Steve Jones, Emeritus Professor of Human Genetics at University College London and Fellow of the Royal Society, author of many best-selling books. And in fact, one of the books that I think really helped me on the way to eventually doing things like The Infinite Monkey Cage. I remember buying Almost Like a Whale in a small bookshop in Manchester, which is sadly no longer there, near the Corner House, and reading it on the journey home and just finding it filled with so many ideas about the nature of life on Earth that had never come anywhere near entering my mind before. And it was one of those kind of almost, without getting too religious, it was almost a Damascene moment reading that book. Steve, hello.
Hello.
I want to start off with, we should start with the beginning of your career and something that you have said in the past, which is you have a guilty secret, and is a guilty secret that you think is shared by many biologists and those who go into genetics as well, that you began as a bird watcher.
Yes, that's right. And even worse, or perhaps slightly better, I began as a completely incompetent bird watcher. I mean, there are many biologists who, a colleague of mine, Linda Partridge, who can spot a greenfinch at 5 miles. I can't. I could say that's a duck. But I did begin as a bird watcher, and it was kind of important to me. In retrospect, my parents, quite unexpectedly, because they didn't really take much notice in my scientific interests, they gave me for my 13th birthday a pair of binoculars, cheap binoculars, but they were good, and I still have them. Dolland and Aitchison's they were, the last British binocular. I still got them, and I used to go bird watching. And I was never any good at it. The place where I used to do it most of all, I lived for my sins on Liverpool's left bank, which is Birkenhead, on the Wirral Peninsula, which is, I have to tell you, a dismally dull place. But one of its strengths was off one of the coasts on the Dee was a little island called Hilbury, which was a famous stopping point for migrating birds. And I used to go out there often, take a bunk off school and go out there and look at the birds. And I had a couple of adventures there. It was cut off by the rising tide, and you had to get back. And I had to get back for the afternoon, or they'd notice I was there. And I suddenly realized I'd been cut off. And so I started wading through this tide, and it was kind of very frightening because, of course, the power of the water is huge. And I just managed to get back. So I survived being a bird watcher.
Now, this is what was that interesting transition. There's that beautiful moment where Richard Feynman talks about his father taking him around the woods in the Catskills, I think, when they were on holiday, and the fact that many of the other children had learnt all the names of the birds. And his father said, yeah, he reeled off all of these supposed different names of a brown-throated thrush, of Japanese and Chinese and French and whatever. And at the end of reeling off what Feynman says are probably many of them made up names, he says, if you know all these things, all you know are the names of the name of that bird in many different countries. Now let's look at the bird. And that seems to be the transition into science, that bit where you go, now let us look at that thing. Let us forget about the names for a moment.
Well, that's a strange thing, because the first expensive book I ever bought, and I had to save up a lot to buy it, was called The Handbook of British Birds, which is 5 volumes, beautifully bound book of the 1950s, which is a real Twitcher's handbook. And I'm very good at the Latin names of birds. The cormorant, Phylacrocorax corbo. I'm good at Latin names of birds, but I wasn't all that good at identifying birds. So that Feynman's dad was right.
I love there's Edwin Collins, the great musician Edwin Collins. I remember meeting him once, and his wife said to me, she said, "Do you know what? He's the kind of person who used to only have one book. The only book he had was a book called Some British Birds." And I thought, now there is an author who lost his nerve at the last minute. I've done the Book of British Birds, all of them. Let's just call it Some British Birds, just in case.
That's right. There are so many British birds which you've only been seeing once. You're never going to see them. But Some British Birds is a good title. Title of my next book, I think. Actually, it's appropriate because my next book, putting in the advertisement, its title is actually Sex, Age and Death. But actually, Some British Birds would say about the same thing, wouldn't it?
So you will be fulfilling your promise always as a geneticist, which is to make sex boring then. Is that the plan of the book?
That's the first line. That's the first line of the book.
It is because I find, when did that transition from bird watching to snails come? Because I remember talking to someone who went for a lengthy walk with you, and as people who maybe I imagine most people know about your work, but your obsession with snails is a wonderful thing to observe. We did an infinite monkey cage on the last series, which was not about snails, but it became about snails because you were the guest on the show. I think we had to change the Radio Times listings to make it entirely about snails. But you have an ability to be able to, literally on a walk, just pick up snails. People don't even notice that you'll end up with pockets filled with snails, and then be able to look at each shell and see the distinction. So when did that fascination really first bloom?
Well, it happened. Yeah, I remember it well, actually. It happened when I was an undergraduate. And in Edinburgh, which was a wonderful place to be a student, and I was very, very happy to be there. I was very well taught. And we went on a field course to Malham Tarn Field Centre in Yorkshire. Where actually I'd been when I was a schoolboy. It's a lovely place. It's a moorland with limestone cliffs. And the bloke who took me, who then became my PhD supervisor, a guy called Brian Clark, we collected some snails on this. I have vivid memories of it on this talus, this slope down from the cliffs. And I picked these snails up, and I thought, Jesus, these things are really beautiful, and they really are. We counted them and we looked at the variation. And I kind of thought, looking back on it, I can remember it now. I kind of thought I'd spend my life working on these things, and I did. But this is in the prehistory of genetics. We're talking about the mid-1960s. And it's worth remembering that in those days, that there were almost no creatures in the wild where you could see genetic variation. If you look at a mouse, it's a bleeding mouse. If you look at a Drosophila melanogaster, it's a goddamn fly. Okay, but these snails were different. They had patterns of inherited diversity in the colors of the shells and the number of stripes on the shells and various other things, which means you could go out into the wild and count genes. And there were almost nothing else. There were some butterflies you could do that with, and plants were a bit better. There were several plants you could do it with, but animals generally, you couldn't do it. So actually, although people laugh at me, I laugh at myself for having spent 40 years, 50 years more looking at snails. Actually, in those days, if you wanted to look at genetic diversity, which is the interesting subject, it was quite a good thing to look at. And I spent years and years doing them. I collected at the last count, 400,000 of them, all over Europe. I went to Yugoslavia. I spent many months in Yugoslavia working on them. I worked on them in Spain, in the Pyrenees. I then got into the boring end of genetics, which is, of course, is molecular genetics. And I started doing protein diversity in them in the Pyrenees. Then we did some DNA diversity with them. So I got a lot out of snails, really. And you tend to forget that the questions that all these advanced molecular genetics ask today are exactly the same questions as we were asking in the 60s with the snails. Why is this variation here? Does it make any difference? Why do they differ from place to place? Do they choose to live in different habitats and all that kind of stuff? So I absolutely do not regret having spent my time working on those slimy creatures.
And you do. I mean, some of the. I remember the first time. I can't remember whether it might have been in your recent book. Actually, Here Comes the Sun, where you talked in the introduction about the diversity between snails in separate valleys, next door valleys in the Pyrenees, yes, is greater than the diversity between chimpanzees and human beings, which I think most people would find remarkable. They would think a snail's a snail, and we're so different to chimpanzees.
Yeah, well, that's the molecular diversity, and that's true. That's true. Yeah, sure. The diversity between two snails in populations in different valleys of the Pyrenees is bigger than the diversity between humans and cows, let alone chimpanzees. But that's that's just the way it is. I mean, humans genetically are the world's most boring animal because we're basically the same everywhere. I mean, there are some rather trivial differences in appearance, which we've begun to understand. But in terms of the measure, it's called FST, the genetic difference between populations, we are the most boring of all primates. The difference between two groups of chimpanzees living maybe 100 kilometers apart in West Africa are bigger, far bigger, than the differences between, the peak of human talent, which is, of course, the French, and Australian Aboriginals, who are the most different from much of the rest of the human population. So we are a very, very boring creature in our bodies, but of course in our minds. That's one of the reasons why we're so boring, because we don't work through our bodies anymore. We work through our culture, through our minds, through our ability to speak, which is what makes us absolutely unique.
No, I mean, just thinking about evolution, I think it was in one of your columns for the Telegraph. I might be wrong, but I remember reading something years ago where you talked about the fact that evolution is ultimately pretty static. That the world used to be filled with bacteria, and it still is, and we are basically froth on a sea of bacteria.
True. Yeah, well, I mean, you're now sitting, as I'm sure you know, on a colon full of the most charming and delightful bacteria, depending what your diet might be. Are you a vegetarian?
I am a vegetarian, but I have just had some Asdarone cheese wiggles, so I think that will jiggles. I'm not sure. So that may well have made that could have.
Well, I'm not quite a vegetarian. I eat fish now and again. So we've got convergent evolution of the contents of our colons.
So that, in that sense, in terms of our picture of evolution, what is it that you think people should understand? Because that seems to me to be something which, when normally we see a tree of life and we see it as a flamboyant sense of progress. We see, these very small creatures, then we see all manner of kind of fascinating sea creatures, then we have the whale, and then we have, again, other larger mammals, and we see that as progress. And you don't really, should that poster just be, here we go, here's bacteria, and then just at the top, almost drowning, the heads of a couple of mammals.
That's true. I mean, Darwin, who was a fairly intelligent man, I have to say, he was very strong on that. He said never say higher or lower, higher creatures and lower creatures. I mean, there's only one exception to that, which I think is fair, which is us, because we are different, unique. Many creationists hate evolution because they think it drags us down to the level of the apes. But I feel exactly the opposite, which is the more you know about evolution, the more you realize that humans are unique. It gives you a new uniqueness from, as Gilbert and Sullivan said, Darwinian man, though well behaved, is nothing but a monkey shaved. And in physical terms, that's true. Some of us I can see are more shaved than others. That's true. But the difference between us and chimpanzees is absolutely trivial. But in every other sense, the difference between us and chimpanzees is absolute. And that's what makes me think that evolution should make humans think, not that they're less special than what they were, which is what creationists accuse us of doing, but they were more special. You realize that on top of our undistinguished frames, we have this unique brain of which there's nothing similar in the entire living world.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? The desire for human exceptionalism. Yeah. When to me it seems like such a far more exceptional story to see all of the variety of life and the richness.
Just 1 second, my wife wants to. Norma, can you turn the oven off? Right, she's turned the oven off now.
It's good. I like these moments. It means everyone knows this is real. It's much like when Chris Hadfield's dog started barking in the background. Now I wanted to ask a little bit about. I've got this actually the updated edition of The Language of Genes, which was your first book.
It's not very updated. It's 2000. That's the prehistory of modern genetics. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what I was. This is based on your Reith lectures of 1991. The book came out in 1993. Now, what do you feel are the things that would most have to be changed? If you were going, I mean, would you basically be wiping away almost the entirety of those Reith lectures, or are there certain things where you go, with this frame of story remains, but within it?
Yes, I don't think I'd write it. I'd wipe it all away. But there's two kinds of science. There's real science, which is physics, right, and as I understand it, which isn't very far. My dad actually was a physicist. The more you learn about physics, the simpler it seems. And biology, of course, is exactly the opposite. The more you learn about biology, the more of a mess it seems. And when I gave those Reith lectures in the early 90s, genetics was beginning to look simple. Well, of course, since then, it's turned, genetics with Mendel started off with peas, okay? It was simple. Now it's become pea soup. Everything is a mess. And in some ways that's reassuring because, there's a great line again from Darwin, I use it all the time, which is that ignorance breeds confidence more than does knowledge. So if you don't know anything about it, then you can be totally confident. And the history of genetics summarizes that absolutely, because in the very early days of genetics, with Galton and co. and with the eugenicists, looking back, they knew nothing. But they were entirely confident that genius, Galton's book was called Hereditary Genius, genius, criminality, everything was in the genes. And of course, we know now that's only extremely partially true. But that led to the disasters of sterilization, not just in Nazi Germany, but in Sweden and the United States, not, I'm glad to say, in Britain. It led directly to the racist movements of the 1930s. And yet we now know that they were totally ignorant about these subjects. And I think that's the most important thing you learn as a biologist, if not as a physicist, that the more you know, the less you understand.
It does. I think either in the introduction of Language of the Genes or maybe in The Blood, you do actually say that it will be filled with the story of genetics has been graced and disgraced by eccentrics and fools.
Yes, it has. I count myself among at least one of those categories. But most of the eccentrics and fools are the people who don't know. Okay, and to be frank, I think they've kind of begun to go away. They certainly hadn't begun to go away when I first wrote, God, I hate him many 30 years ago when I first wrote that book. I think they've begun to go away now. The good thing about genetics is that actually it's become just another science. It's not a sword of Damocles poised over your head. It's not the cure for all human social and medical problems. It's just another science. And I think that's been its biggest advance in the last 30 years.
It's interesting. I suppose that there was a time when it was used to justify things like racism, whereas now it's quite the opposite. Thinking about the recent.
I've always had mixed feelings about that. I remember when I worked in the States. Which I've done on and off for years. But when I worked with a guy called Dick Lewontin, who was still with us but old, and it was just the very beginning of the time in 1968 when somebody in the Galton laboratory at UCL, which is where I now work, 50 years later, had begun to realize by taking blood samples from people of different ethnic background. It was then a surprising finding. It was a quite unexpected finding. It was that actually that Africans and Europeans were not entirely different, which scientifically even in those days, forgetting all the political and social stuff, seemed not unreasonable to assume, because Africans and Europeans and Chinese do look reasonably different. Okay, but it was a big surprise in 1968 to find that actually, in terms of the difference between snails in Pyrenean valleys, they're scarcely different at all. Okay, basically we're all Africans. Some of us are more African than others, the ones who are still in Africa, but the rest of us are just a small sample of all Africans. And I remember being in Chicago with Lewontin, who was a kind of lefty geneticist. He didn't say it, but we were discussing this work, and somebody said, "Oh, that's wonderful to find that Africans and Europeans are really almost identical. That means that racism is wrong." And even in my naive state of those days, I said, "Hang on a minute. Does that mean if we discover that Africans and Europeans are actually more different than we thought, does that mean that racism is right?" And since then, with DNA, rather than proteins, which it was in those days, it has turned out that Africans and Europeans and certain groups of Africans, the Khoisan in South Africa most of all, are somewhat distinct from Europeans and the rest of the world, which isn't surprising because, as I said, we're all a small sample of Africans when they came out and filled the world. But does that make racism right? I don't think so. I mean, the two things are totally independent of each other.
It's interesting in the last few years. I wonder or indeed, in fact, going back to the 60s, where you talk about, and as has been mentioned quite a few times on this show, that it feels to a bystander that these have been a couple of revelatory decades in terms of our understanding of genetics. At the same time, as you said, it's also made things even messier, and nature and nurture becomes an even more messy kind of. But do you feel in the last 20 years, what for you have been the most revelatory moments in terms of those moments where you almost felt the ground shifting beneath you?
Can I talk about snails for a minute?
Of course you can. And to be honest, I've been disappointed they've been lacking for the last 5 minutes. Well,
the funny thing is, the one thing there are two things I remember. I mean, I was young at the time. There was as I said, these snails vary in the number of stripes they have, whether they're color, what color there is, whether they're either black or white. And they'd been collected in Britain. And as I said some time ago, these were the only things we could work on. There was almost no other variable systems. And there was a claim that what drove the differences between British populations of these snails were local differences in climate, microclimate. And there were frost hollows where cold air accumulated, and it paid to be dark in colour, so you could warm up in the morning when the sun came down and you warmed up. And everybody walked around saying, "Oh, this is true, this isn't true." And being a nerd as I was in the 60s, I didn't go to the internet, but I bought a book about frost hollows. I read a book about frost hollows. And it said that the biggest frost hollows in Europe are in the Velebit Mountains in what was then Yugoslavia, is now Croatia. So I thought, well, screw this. Let's go and have an expedition to the Velebit Mountains, which is what we did. And lo and behold, the frost hollows were quite amazing. And down in the bottoms of these basins where it was cold, there were lots of dark-coloured snails, and on the slopes of the basins, where in the morning when the sun came up, there was mist down below and it was sunny on the slopes. There were lots of light-coloured ones because they didn't heat up, and the ones in the bottom had to when the mist cleared, they needed to heat up quickly. So I thought, and I was walking. God, I haven't thought about this for years. I was collecting snails around the cliffs of Cornwall about in the late 60s with a friend of mine who's now professor of Oxford, was professor of zoology at Oxford, and is somewhat, he'd be the first to admit, a bit of somewhat of a pain in the neck. We were walking around the cliffs collecting these snails, having a lot of fun. It was 1968, St. Ives, 1968. Where else would you want to be? Hippie capital of the world. And we walked past a big board which had lots of wires attached to it. And, big, thick electrical wires pointing southwest. And I was in the pub that night. I fell into conversation with some primitive Cornish person. And I said, "What's that bloody board up there about?" And he said, "Oh, well, what it is that what they want to know is whether the different colors of insulation, whether they break down in the sun more than others." And a little light went on over my head. And I said, "Hang on a minute." So I thought maybe I could make a dye which fades most quickly in the sun. And I thought, how am I going to do this? And we're talking about the late 60s, early 70s. And of course, people wore jeans in those days. And I thought, bad joke coming up. We'll do some gene manipulation, I thought. So I got some denim and I cut it into squares and I put it on snails. And that didn't work. So I thought, well, okay, let's see what the dye in these genes is actually called. It's called Kumasi blue. It's a dye which fades in the sun. So I thought, how am I going to deal with that? So then I had another right idea, which is to take yellow paint, stable yellow paint, car paint, and dissolve this dye in it to make a green paint. And then you could dot this green paint onto thousands, literally thousands of snails, and see whether the snails of different color faded more in the sun than others. In other words, whether they spent more or less time in the sun. And the answer was sure as hell they did. And that kind of helped explain why the variation is there, because by having all that diversity of color, and sunlight kills snails. I mean, they have to shuttle in and out of it. Some could stay in the shade, some could go out in the sun. So it was a matter of what we call diversifying selection. And it was a very neat piece of work, which I published in Nature some years ago. As far as I know, it's never been referred to since.
It's lovely that it's St. Ives. I think it reminds me of being in the sculpture garden of Barbara Hepworth, and just seeing the cobwebs all over the sculptures, and then actually seeing a snail approaching one. It's a beautiful thing to see a snail approaching contemporary art and wondering how it will perceive it. I better ask some of the questions that we've been sent in. Victoria Smith would like to know, each time some new discovery is made in genetics, it always seems to just strengthen Darwin's theory rather than find holes in it. Why is that theory in particular so strong?
Well, Darwin's book is called The Origin of Species, and you've got to remember it was a brief history of time of its day. It was written as a popular book, and that's why it's such a wonderful book. Because he keeps saying, he breaks off now and again saying, I have far more information on this fact. And in times to come, I will explain this in much more detail. And he spent the rest of his life doing that. He wrote another, 13 books, was it? Which did that. But the beauty of The Origin of Species is its immediacy. It starts off with the simplest thing you can imagine, which is the difference between different breeds of cattle and sheep. And, you all know that different breeds of cattle descend from the same cattle, and the sheep ditto. And he lays that down, and he just walks the way through the subject, adding layer and layer and layer to its argument. And finally, 1 page away from the end, he says, light will be cast upon man and his origins. So it's an entirely logical book. So I don't remember what the question was again.
Well, just what is it about that theory that makes it so strong that just
because it's the strange thing about Darwin's book. It's called On the Origin of Species, all right, by natural selection and preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. But oddly enough, It's not about the origin of species. And the origin of species is still a very recalcitrant issue in evolutionary biology. We're not entirely sure what species are, not quite sure how they started. But the beauty of the book is that it makes sense. It makes you realize that we are on a tree. And we're not on a high branch or a low branch of a tree. We are simply on a tree of descent. And the evidence for that is now absolutely overwhelming. And the more people deny that, the more overwhelming the evidence sees. And as I said a few minutes ago, many people say that this diminishes them. But to me and to many other biologists, it doesn't. It increases their feeling of being human. So I have no time. It's just so silly to try and deal with creationists who just deny the facts. That's, the flat earth analogy is a bit silly, but that's what it is. I mean, they do their own case far more damage than they do mine.
Yeah, I think it's that thing which if someone asks, well, how come we come from apes? You think, well, this is not the first time they've asked this, and they have been answered 1,000 times with a very, logical and reasoned answer. I must ask you if you remember, because I remember one of the things, I think maybe it was in Almost Like a Well, I love that one of the early criticisms on the origin of species, I think from an editor, was why don't you concentrate more on pigeons? People love homing.
Totally remembering that. Yeah, that's very funny. Yeah, because it starts off with pigeons. Pigeons are in chapter 1, and it seems a weird thing to do, but actually it was not a weird thing to do, because if you look at the different breeds of pigeons, the ones that shit all over Camden Square, who are the primitive pigeons, the ones in Camden are the most primitive in the world, by the way. And you look at all the crazy breeds that are around, you cannot but believe that one or the breeds evolved from the wild pigeons. So yeah, but it would have been a really good book about pigeons.
Well, I always recommend, as you know, I'm a huge fan on the book of earthworms. I think that's got some there's so many. I think that's an interesting, because it's something I would always encourage people to do. And you're probably one of the reasons that I started reading them, which is that they shouldn't be books that are feared. That his writing is so beautiful as well, and so full of maybes. That's one of the things that I love. He never says this is the way. He says, well, I had this letter from someone and then they said this about a dog, and I thought, well, there's a possibility that's one of the things that I also find joyous about his work.
Yeah. Well, the Earthworms book, the Earthworms book sold 5 times as many as the Origin of Species. And that's because when the Earthworms came out, which is his last book, just a few months before he died, that gardeners actually thought that earthworms were a pest. And they were like, nematode worms. We have to get rid of the bloody earthworms. And they used to do all kinds of strange things. They used to put a steel rod into the soil and play it with the bow of a violin in the hope that this would frighten the earthworms away. Mad but true. And of course, Darwin, he was the most amazing person. What did he do? He put earthworms and a mouse corpse into a big bottle, with some soil. And within a week, the corpse had been buried by the action of the earthworms. And he realized that the earthworms made the soil. And without the earthworms, mammalian evolution wouldn't have happened. And he gave the earthworms a new nobility, I felt.
Well, I love that, mentioning the violin, that now makes sense with, of course, the fact that, playing the bassoon to earthworms to see how they would react as well.
Yes, exactly. They didn't. They did to the piano. He put them on top of a grand piano. And the low notes, which were, of course, vibrated them, they woke up a bit. But no, they weren't big bassoon people.
Well, I highly recommend anyone watching this, if you want to start with the Darwin book, because it's quite a short book as well. It's not as long as some of the major works, Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, etc. Start on Earthworms and you'll be surprised how much delight you find in it.
Start with The Voyage of the Beagle. That's a wonderful book.
Oh, with Voyage of the Beagle is, yes, and that's, but also all of that's what amazes me about his writing, is so many things which I presumed were in the main books, and you find out, some of the journal entries and letters, and those huge collections of letters. Again, very rarely do you come across one which doesn't have something in it, which even it's sometimes as little as a delightful phrase, but sometimes the entire story within it.
Yeah, that's true. He was I never met him, but I met many of his descendants. Yeah.
Well, I think another good place to start if people is I think Annie's Box has a lot of very interesting
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
tales.
yeah. Well, that's by one of his descendants. Yes, that's true. The death of his daughter. Yes, he was very struck by that, very hurt by that. There's no question. Yeah, yeah. It was a fascinating. I mean, his kids were remarkable people. His grandson, what's his name? Leonard. I can't. Bernard Darwin was Britain's first golf champion. So it was obviously a highly talented family.
Oh, this is so. Now, after Age, Sex, and Death, I can see that the golfing book is also waiting. That's the thing, and always snails. There will always be snails within. I will, because we've only got a few minutes left. I did just want to ask you about, in terms of what have you found most frustrating in terms of perhaps the myths or half truths about genetics? Because again, because it feels that it's something which people in newspapers, they like to write about it. It is the kind of thing that people like to read. It has a level like Neanderthals of a certain kind of science clickbait to it. Do you find there are certain things that you are having to demolish with greater regularity at the moment?
When it comes to the general public, I would say things have got better, really. I mean, it's no longer the solution to everything or an anti-human disaster. What I find depressing among students is that UCL, University College London, where I work, which is where modern human genetics really began, students hate it. I think the biology students don't, but the students as a whole do. I mean, I'm not particularly worried about naming professorships or buildings about people, but Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, who wrote a book called Hereditary Genius, as you know, founded the eugenics movement. Marie Stopes was a great progenitor of the eugenics movement, and she was a lecturer at UCL. There are many people at UCL. If you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, where you read their writings about eugenics and sterilizing the unfit and all that stuff, it makes your hair stand on end. I mean, this is just dreadful. This isn't science. This is uninformed science masquerading as politics. But at UCL, there's been this really quite annoying, not very annoying, but certainly slightly annoying attempt to rename all the spaces named after Haldane, after Galton, after Spearman, who invented the IQ coefficient and so on. And this strikes me as just stupid, because if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when human genetics had just begun, this is the way that people thought. And if you look at the way they thought and their political views, they are now completely unacceptable. But political views change, all right? Scientific views, at least the basis of science, don't change. So that these people actually got the science right, and they were very important figures in the field. And it just depresses me that students, most of all, but actually the general public, the media as well, cannot separate the science from the politics. They're entirely divorced from each other, and that's more important in genetics than in any other science.
Right, I've got one more question, which is specifically about your career now, from someone which has just come in from Sounds 106. With Paul Nurse, quite early on in this series, we were talking about research found in the bottom drawer. That kind of that idea of you suddenly go, oh, good Lord, I hadn't realised. I'd forgotten I'd written that paper, or I'd forgotten about this collection of shells. And this is what Sounds 106 would like to know. Given the amount of field work that you've done, do you ever wonder if there's some big discovery in all the data that you might not have looked at for years?
God, that's a question that stings. I have huge amounts of data. I'm not sure there's any great discoveries in them, but I have 50 or 60 boxes. I mean, I was a hard worker. I used to go out with gangs of people and do field work. I had 12 or 15 people working with me. So I got gigantic quantities of data, and I never wrote it up. It's like, what was it? Pascal's lost Fermat's theorem? Yes, Fermat's theorem, right? Where he wrote in the margins of a scientific book, I have the answer to this question. And nobody knows what the answer is. So maybe I have the answer to the genetics of snails, and even I don't know what the answer is.
Well, the trick is make sure you leave a few diaries dotted around where you just mention you've had the answer, and at the very least, people will believe that you knew. And that's that's Sun Tzu's art of war, isn't it? As long as they believe that you knew, that's half the story told for them. And one final thing, which is, I remember you wrote one. Genetics has nothing to say about what makes people more than machines, driven by biology. Does that remain true?
Yes, that absolutely remains true. I mean, you can see that in those rare occasions when conflicts break out, and in wartime, then we become machines driven by our biology. I've just read a book by what's his name? It's called Berlin. It's about the invasion of Germany from the east by the Russians, and of course the Russians, in those dreadful days, hated the Germans because they'd done awful things. And what they did, they turned both sides turned into animals. Right? I mean, they raped, they murdered, they tortured. It was just absolutely awful. So that the potential for humans to become animals is always there. But fortunately, we all read The Guardian.
Thank you so much, Steve. You were only halfway through your supper. Now you can have the second half. Okay. I will mention to everyone watching, by the way, that as there are always wonderful tangential moments which are worth it for tremendous anecdotes. So Here Comes the Sun is out now. Thank you very much to everyone who made Genetic Shambles possible over the last few months. With luck, we will return, hopefully in a time where you're all free as well at the same time. And thank you very much to our producer, Trent Burton, and have a lovely evening. Good night.
Bye-bye.